Okay, welcome. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kevin Vallier. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Toledo. He earned his PhD at the University of Arizona under the supervision of the well-known philosopher Jerry Gauss. He's done a postdoc at Brown's Political Theory Project and was previously professor of philosophy at Bowling Green's University Institute of American Constitutional Thought and Leadership from 2012 to 2024. His most recent book, which many of our undergraduates are reading, is called All the Kingdoms of the World, Radical Religious Alternatives to Liberalism. That's Oxford University Press 2023. Some of his other book publications include Trust in a Polarized Age, 2020, Must Politics Be War, 2018, and Liberal Politics and Public Faith. He also writes at his Substack, which is called The Liberal Tortoise. And I forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Jeffrey Sigalet. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at UBCO. And I'm also the convener of our PPE conversations, of which this is the second this year, I think. And I should also just take a minute to thank our EPP UBCO staff for helping make this possible. And I'd be remiss if I also didn't thank the Institute for Liberal Studies, which helped support this event and make it possible today. So we're very grateful to them. And I'd like to thank the gate agent at WestJet that helped Professor Vallier get here today, and Jesus for that too. Yeah. We should all take pity on Professor Vallier because he's from the American South. I think you're originally from Alabama. Is that right?
Born in Mobile.
So, I'm not sure how cold Toledo is, but this is a great, glorious -9.
Not so bad.
He's not so bad. Okay, good. So then we won't take pity on you. We'll welcome you. So please join me in offering Professor Vallier a very warm UBCO welcome.
So, after Donald Trump was elected in 2016, there had always been a lot of ideological diversity on the right, on the American right. But the American right had a way of saying, okay, here's the people that are sort of nuts and that are out, and here's the people that are in, and okay. That mechanism completely broke down. And so what you see now on the American political right is a vast array of small kind of ideological sectarian groups. And the really fascinating thing about this is that it would be totally irrelevant to all of you if it had not been the intellectual milieu of the Vice President of the United States. For instance, J.D. Vance was first employed by Peter Thiel, founder of PayPal, but also who has been responsible for making massive financial contributions to many of these different groups, even the ones he disagrees with, and helped fund Vance's Senate campaign. And the view that I'm going to talk about today is the one with which he is quite familiar and is friends with many of the people that advocate the view that I will be assessing and criticizing. It's all going to seem very strange and ethereal in a certain way when I talk about these ideas. And when I started working on it, I did it because I was interested in them. But since then, I've been interviewed by the Associated Press, by the Religion News Service. I've spoke to Politico, New York Magazine, and in many cases at some length because they want to understand what exactly is going on. Because Vance is arguably the most philosophically and ideologically sophisticated vice president in a very long time, maybe since Nixon. People sort of forget. He was vice president under Eisenhower, and people forget. So what we're seeing, I think, is the importance of trying to understand this sort of very chaotic, but also increasingly and sort of shockingly even influential set of positions. So I think for those of you with something of a theological background, this I think may be of intrinsic interest, but at the very least for those of you who don't, trying to understand these ideas I think can have a lot of utility just in trying to understand kind of the broader background of particularly what's going on in American politics. But in general, I mean, if you look at kind of right-wing populist movements, and you look at the kind of ideas that they're trying to bring together or appeal to, they're oftentimes very, very sophisticated. And so when Oxford invited me to write on kind of illiberalism in general, I decided I would focus on the most philosophically sophisticated and interesting version of these groups, the doctrine that I thought had a well over 1,000-year lineage, and that had been forgotten relatively recently in historical time. But to understand that, we've got to set a little bit of context about how modern political thought works, how pre-modern medieval political thought worked, at least in Latin Christendom, right? The Latin-speaking part of the Roman Empire, whose infrastructure had collapsed many centuries ago. So I'm going to start off by kind of telling you a story about the development of political thought, particularly within Christianity, the way in which sort of modernity led a great deal of that to kind of stop or to be forgotten, and then some factors that led to its revival. And then I'm going to present you with the problem and then try to show, I think, that there's a problem here that's pretty severe in terms of the way in which I think certain pre-modern religious views or religious political ideologies think about the use of coercion and approach the issue of religious freedom. So just go from there. So since really Hobbes and Locke, the way that we think about doing political philosophy at all, if we're asking what should the government do, what should the law be, what are our obligations, what are our rights, we do it like this. We say there's the state, right, the government on the one hand, and then there's the individual and maybe small groups and families on the other, right? So there's one polity, and then there's everybody else. And the interesting question is, what's the relationship between the individual or the small group and the polity? Right. Now, if you read a lot of medieval political philosophy, which people don't really do, and they don't do because it's actually pretty different, it's almost always talking not just about the state, but about the church and the proper structure of the church. And you might say, oh, that's just because they were very religious or whatever. The early modern period is not a period where people stop being very religious. It's really something else is going on. And this is what I think is going on. When the Western Roman Empire collapses, you have an extraordinarily powerful church relative to the size of political orders at that time. Kings are very weak. There's not very much they can do, especially in comparison to, say, the Eastern Empire, which didn't collapse for another century or another millennium. So you had this remarkable position that you've had really in no other major religion, because most religions do not have the kind of centralized hierarchy that Christianity, pre-Protestant Christianity, has had. So you have also the Pope eventually gaining his own temporal domains, the papal states in the 8th century. And so you have this very strange period that lasts really until 1870, where you have an ecclesiastical leader, a religious leader, who has functions as a temporal sovereign. There are other cases of this occurring in Western history and world history, of course. But it's just to sort of bring out that the church saw itself as its own polity. And not just its own earthly polity, like, oh, here are my domains in central Italy, but rather as a kind of body of law and decision that applied to people for the sake of that community's common good. It's just that it was your spiritual common good, right? And your eternal good, not just individually, but collectively. And so in much of medieval political thought, at least in the Latin West, there's two polities. Right? People are members of both polities. Basically, everybody's baptized. So you're not just a citizen of one country, or maybe a dual citizen of two earthly countries, right? If you're baptized, you're a member of two polities, an earthly polity and a heavenly polity. Now, when Hobbes and Locke came along, they're seeing that, oh, look, we never know who's kind of in charge, and we disagree about theology a lot more now than we did before. And so they're thinking, look, if we keep treating the church as a polity, we're just going to keep killing each other. So we have to reconceive of what we're doing. We have to reconceive of what the church is, how to understand the church. It's a very important part of what Hobbes and Locke are doing in parts of their writings that are often not read, but I think to an extent in the stuff that is. So today we do one polity political theory, as I call it. We ask, here's the state, how do we relate to it? What should it do? But much of medieval political thought was saying, okay, here are these two polities. How are they to relate to one another? Which one's superior? Who gets to do what? We still had discussions about church and state, but we think of the church as a civil institution, right? Not as a polity. But it's really, really sensible approach in a way within Christianity for the following reason. There's plenty of biblical language, for instance, in the founding of the Christian church about your citizenship, say, being in heaven. There's plenty also language of the church, of the state being founded independently of the church. So you go to 1 Samuel 8 with the founding of the state of Israel, and Romans 13, right, where it seems clear that Paul is thinking that God is authorizing governments to sort of exist, including the Roman Empire, right, which is busy persecuting Christians. So God is authorizing the existence of an earthly polity, states, to look after the good of the people. But it's not by way of the church, right? And the same thing in reverse on the church. The church is directly created by Jesus, okay, not by way of the state, okay? So God has directly authorized these two polities to do their own sorts of thing and been not sort of clear, but, you know, we render under Caesar what is Caesar's, we render under God what is God. So there's a clear jurisdictional differentiation between these two institutions. There's no other religion like that of the major world religions. It's very, very distinctive in that regard. But of course, this raises the question, which is, in cases of conflict, which is superior? Which of these two polities is superior? And a great many people thought about it in the following way. They said, well, okay, look, the church has the nobler goal. It's a more important goal. It's salvation. It's an infinite good. Must be more important than the ones in charge of temporal goods. But they can't say that means that the church should run everything, because God has given the state its own authority, right? So the church and the state have their own missions, but the church's mission is nobler, and much of the state does impacts the church and its mission. It impacts what the church can do and is able to do. So you have all of these extraordinary medieval theologians, and they all want to speak to this question. And you get a range of opinion. Okay, on one end, you get hierarchy, where particularly in Rome, people are defending the Pope's temporal power, in particular to determine who the Roman emperor is, or the title of Roman emperor. It's a long story. I talk about it in the book. It's pretty interesting. The thought of the popes could make and unmake kings at will. Well, this is partly because they believed that Emperor Constantine had donated his diadem to Pope Sylvester for curing him of leprosy. So he literally had the crown of Roman emperor, could decide who it was. It was contingent. That's a forgery, but it mattered in medieval Western politics. So you have this one view in which the Pope had tons of temporal power, just tons of it. Right? You have this other view, which is much more common, and in different places is called Caesaropapism. So it's a kind of a relationship between church and state that you see, say, in 19th century Russia, but also way on back to the Byzantine, back up through the Byzantine Empire. But it's called Gallicanism in France, so you may have heard of it through that way, or Erastianism in England, you may have heard of it in that way. So the king has an extraordinary amount of ecclesiastical or religious power. Typically, they can't define dogma, but they can enforce it. They can call councils that decide on dogma, right? People forget this, but it wasn't the Pope that called the ecumenical councils. You've heard of the Council of Nicaea. It wasn't the Pope that called it. It was actually the Byzantine Emperor that called it. And so this was a time in which, you know, temporal rulers were playing a huge amount of a role in the development of Christian history. But in the middle, you got this view that I think it's actually like, given the constraints, like given the way you've set up the problem, and it actually makes a lot of sense. The thought is, okay, look, church and state have their own divine mission. The church's mission is nobler, and so where the state's actions impinge directly on the salvation of souls, that is in matters of faith and morals, the church can authorize it to act to enforce its or promote its spiritual mission. Now, in many medieval polities, the way this essentially works, say, is if you were declared, say, by a canonical court, that is a church court, that you were a heretic, they would excommunicate you. If you didn't repent within a year, why, then you would be handed over to the civil power in order to be disciplined. And for the great heretics, the punishment became incineration. Because it was taken very seriously. The thought was religious pluralism and disagreement was seen not just as a threat to people's salvation, but to temporal order itself. So the thought is that the church has what came to be called an indirect power over the state, an indirect power over the state. And so you can see how it's a kind of way of trying to square the circle here, right? Because you have to say, oh, they're both independent, but the one's a little bit better. And that must matter in terms of law. So how does that work, right? And so the doctrine of indirect power you see in all kinds of people. I think that's hinted at in Aquinas in the 13th century, but people even the ones that conservative Thomists give all kinds of grief to, like Occam, I think, when Occam believed in indirect power, becomes an important part of the political philosophy of the School of Salamanca. So figures like Vittoria and Suarez. And it's also fairly common in Rome. In fact, I would even say it's probably the standard approach to church-state relations in Rome throughout the entire 19th century, and even arguably early in the 20th. And again, because even though the church becomes much less politically powerful. I mean, Italian unification forces stripped the Pope of the Papal States in 1870. So that was just the end of any kind of real political power that was direct, legal. And so what you end up with is a doctrine that to us seems, pretty shocking, totally crazy, unrealistic. But at a time, actually, it was quite feasible, and there's actually a kind of weird, fascinating kind of thought about how these two polities would be integrated. You've heard the doctrine of Catholic integralism is just as what I've described. So through the church's development, the Catholic Church's development in the 20th century, it moves further and further away until Second Vatican Council in the early 60s, where it's setting aside this doctrine forever. It's wanting to insist on the rights of Catholics, for instance, all over the world, particularly against communist governments. And what essentially the old view says that, well, we can use religious coercion against people for their own good, but no one else can. And so that was seen as being kind of bad theology, but also bad diplomacy in a certain important way. And so by the time you get to the late 19th century, this view just completely disappeared. People have totally forgotten about it. But then a couple of cultural events start to happen in the particularly late 2000s, early 2010s. And this is in particular the extremely rapid social progress of the LGBT movement, particularly in the United States. There was this long period of time where American Catholics in particular felt, okay, well, they don't really trust us here. We've got to kind of figure out how much do we accommodate, how much do we not. So Catholics debate this tremendously. And the more accommodationist folks had been, doing rather well, right? You have JFK, for instance, saying, look, I'm my own guy. I'm not going to do what the Pope says when I'm president. And, there's a lot of Catholic conservatives that are very influential. And, obviously, lots of connections to Pope John Paul II. And I think the thought, particularly in the United States, and I don't know the Canadian story as well, that Catholics would be kind of like fully integrated into democratic politics and accepted and treated as equals with the dominant Protestant populations. I mean, for y'all, Quebec it's an entire own internal story to even tell. So it's not analogous to the US at all. And what starts to happen is that while the church is holding on to its traditional teachings about sex and gender, and there's a variety of Catholics that are saying, oh, okay, wait. We're hated again. Our views are despised again. We were supposed to be able to be on board with this liberal democratic project. That was the whole thing, right? We had moved into modernity. We had made our peace with modern liberal democracy and the capitalist welfare state. And we were supposed to be able to compete in an exit playing field. We go out there with our own parties or groups or candidates. We'd make our argument on our own terms. We would be treated as equals. And if we had more traditional social views, we were against euthanasia, we were pro-life or what have you. If we wanted to restrict same-sex marriage or what have you, we could just say that, right? And so I think a lot of younger people, particularly younger intellectual Catholics, felt, okay, we fought really hard to be kind of, as we see it, equal citizens. And all of a sudden now we're despised again for our traditional views, if for different views this time around than others. Instead of being hated by conservative Protestants, being hated for being, say, bigoted or something along those lines. Actually, the big bias against Catholics historically in the United States across the country, whether they be secular progressives all the way to religious Protestants, is that Catholics are anti-democratic. So that wasn't the complaint sort of now. And a lot of folks, particularly a number of Catholic intellectuals, particularly in my generation, started to think, okay, maybe accommodating the American project was a mistake. Maybe the way that American views about sex and gender developed meant that the Catholic Church and sincere Catholics could not be at home in a sort of standard multicultural liberal democratic polity. Because the people that ran these polities were going to invariably end up being secular progressives that thought that they were beneath contempt. And I think that particularly starting in around 2013, 2014, this is when Obergefell, our Supreme Court ruling legalizing same-sex marriage, was handed down. But it's also when the people who were trying to revive this doctrine started to sort of put their heads together and start doing a lot of the writing that they were doing. A lot of actually really interestingly sort of prominent people. Vance is my age, and so he wasn't Catholic at that time. He didn't convert to Catholicism in 2016. But there are a number of different people involved. And the thought was, okay, look, if liberalism told us that we would be treated as equals, and all we had to do was just be willing to be tolerant of others, and that toleration thing was a lie, we need to reconceive of how we've been thinking about politics. Maybe we've been full sort of liberal propaganda. Maybe we need to ask ourselves, what is the ultimate point of political order? What is it really all about? Let's step away from the American Constitution. Let's step away from even where the modern church is right now. And let's just say, what should politics do? Well, it should do the good. It should promote the common good. Well, what is the common good? Well, we have a sense about what it's like now in the temporal domain, but it also has a spiritual component. And so it seems crazy to not have the state involved in politics and actually promoting religious goods unless you have some sort of pragmatic objection. Maybe you don't do it because it doesn't work. But in principle, if you could, well, you should, because these are infinite goods, right? Of course you should promote the ultimate good. And as soon as people started saying this, there was just a total eruption, particularly in Christian intellectual circles, where you had this small group of people proposing this crazily radical thing, and yet they could defend themselves in part because they could just break open all of these old theologians and treatises and stuff and say, actually, Suarez is defending this view for about 400 pages against James I, who's rejecting it. And so unlike many of the other sort of groups like those surrounding, forgive me, kind of more odd figures like Bronze Age pervert or whatever, you have lots of these different little groups. This is the one, if you went to this little group of people and you said, what do you have to say for yourselves? And they said, well, Aquinas. And then, then the conversation slows down. And that's because, in the absence of sort of modern pluralism, where disagreement about these matters is illimitable, and the absence of a sort of long history of people trying to figure out what institutions to have that allow them to get along with one another, there's this temptation to say, okay, look, if that whole liberal thing is a lie, if that whole toleration thing is bunk, we have to just go for the political good. We were restraining ourselves because we thought that we would have a fair arrangement. We would have a fair experience as equal citizens. But it turns out that just wasn't true. Liberalism wasn't neutral. And we might as well just go for what we think is best. And this is what they thought was best. Because this is what the church had taught and tried to accomplish and be for centuries and centuries and centuries. So I've explained to you why this kind of medieval view makes a certain kind of sense, because it's set it up that way. But of course, the modern church has something to say for itself as well. And the modern church speaks in terms that are common or shared with many different religious and secular doctrines, the idea of the dignity of the human person as grounding fundamental and universal human rights, right? Now, the foundations of human dignity for a Roman Catholic is that we're made in God's image. Secular people have a different foundation, but it's usually thought that there's some inviolable functions or features of the individual that means that they have certain rights, certain basic rights, rights to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so on. And so the modern Catholic Church, totally rejecting this older integralist view, will say, well, look, everyone has religious freedom in virtue of their dignity. They're made free and rational beings by God, and they're to choose God or reject God freely. And that holds for everybody, whether they're baptized or, that is, whether they're members of the church or not. But for the integralist, the Catholic Church is a little bit like how some Sunni Islamic polities operate, a few of them in the Arab world, where there's the set of religious law, so canon law in the Catholic case, the Sharia Islamic case, that apply to Muslims or to, say, Catholics or the baptized Christians, but don't apply outside of it. And so roughly here, the thought is that, look, if you have members of a religion, there's a special law that God has given. Enforcing that law is good for them because it helps to keep them on the spiritual straight and narrow. And why, if we could get to a point where there's enough people that agreed with that system of law, that we would implement it. We would bring it back, right? That's not an unheard of thing to try in the 20th century or the 21st for that matter. So you have two kinds of fundamentally different political orientations, one of which was dominant for centuries, which is, well, and sort of draws even on ancient politics. What should the state do? The good, right? And what is the good? Well, there's different theories of that, but somebody's right about it. And presumably that's what the state should do, is promote the true good. If you're a Roman Catholic, then there's this account of what promoting the true good consists in, again, with this historical lineage. On the other hand, you say, we live in a situation of modern pluralism. We see that revelation is not given to everyone, but everyone still has dignity. Everyone still knows right from wrong. Everyone still is free. We have to be able to communicate in people politically in terms that can be jointly, rationally recognized in some form or another. We can all see the dignity of the human person. We can all see the foundations for basic human rights. And my own view on this is, even though I'm not a Roman Catholic myself, I'm Eastern Orthodox, but a similar issue arises, I think, within any Christian denomination and also many other religions, because there's always this question of, if we think we know what the religious truth is, why on earth shouldn't the government be helping us to do it? And you need an answer to that sort of very simple thought, other than, well, it would probably not work out. Right? You want to be able to say something more than the only reason we're not imposing our religion on others is because we can't figure out how to do it quite right. Right? At least I think as modern citizens of democracies, we want to be able to say something fuller than, well, you're not under my thumb because, you'd be difficult about it and probably rebel. So what we're left with is what I call a baptism puzzle. For the integralist, if you're baptized, you're subject to the canon law of the church, and the church can authorize the state to help enforce its law. You could, for instance, undergo some kind of civil penalties, imprisonment, say, for apostasy, that is leaving the faith, or heresy, stubbornly and knowingly teaching against its core doctrines. Now, the standard modern Catholic position is going to seem obvious basically to all of us. We all believe in the dignity of the individual. We all think more or less that grounds at least certain kinds of ways that you may not be treated, right? That you can't be tortured or killed arbitrarily, that you should have at least some degree of freedom of speech, press, religion, and so on, right? That's kind of in our practice. It's kind of a structure of our civilization. And even within Catholicism, your dignity grounds your rights regardless of whether you're baptized or not. Your baptism saves you, forgives original sin, imparts sanctifying grace. Granted, it does all the things that Catholics teach that it does, and yet it's not going to affect what our human rights are. Why would it do that? Okay, so that's the overwhelmingly dominant perspective in the Catholic Church today. But the trying to understand, I think, the significance of, again, this sort of strange doctrine is that this integralist doctrine is that it is, one, really intuitive, and two, a kind of weird thing that people turned out to fall back on when they became skeptical of liberal democracy and skeptical of the very idea of a sort of liberal tolerationist regime. And I can tell you, among those American Catholics, y'all's experience with euthanasia only confirms their belief. In a quite striking way. They say, oh, look, it's not just the United States, it's these other countries that, where the UK is handling hate speech right now is another thing. The thought is, there's no liberal neutrality. What happens is you remove Christianity and liberalism becomes wokeism, and that's as much of a religious or spiritual doctrine to these folks as Catholicism is, or at least it has as much rational basis as Catholicism does. On their view, modern egalitarian views on sex and gender are every bit as rationally defensible, if much less rationally defensible, than Catholic moral teaching. So what happens then when trust starts to break down in a liberal democracy, and you have people that have these sort of ancient and venerable intellectual traditions, and they were kind of holding off of them because they wanted to get along with other people, but they felt like, well, if they're not going to be tolerated, why would they bother, right? And so, people do come back to a whole variety of different views, and you can see a lot of them on display. Now, I do think there are interesting ways, at least from a broadly religious perspective, but also within the particular Catholic context, of trying to make further sense of kind of pre-modern approach. And here's the rough idea. When you're baptized, according to the Catholic Church, you become a member of the church. That secures your citizenship in heaven. So it makes you a citizen of a polity. Baptism makes you a citizen of a polity. Something was serious about that for Catholicism. The baptism would give you citizenship. Right? You could have birthright citizenship for an earthly polity. You could have second birthright citizenship for being a baptized Catholic. So that's actually not strange, the idea that baptism would change what your rights are, but your rights within the church. You become a member of the church. Now you have new rights and responsibilities. Just like when you become a citizen, you have certain rights and responsibilities. That's not actually strange at all. So then the question becomes, and this is the central question, which is the medieval view correct that the church can authorize the state to act as its sort of assistant? It's the classical medieval term used. It'll come to me. Secular arm. Yes, the church's secular arm is the term that was used. Secular meaning just non-religious, not atheistic. So can the church authorize the state to enforce its law? If someone's baptized, they're given a fair trial and excommunicated for some kind of sin. They refuse to come around. The church can say, okay, government, go out there, put them in the stockade or lock them up for a little while. Maybe they'll come to their senses. Let's see if we can do that. Let's see if we can pull that off. What would be wrong with that? Now on the one hand, it seems obvious what's wrong with that. It just seems wrong, like a violation of fundamental liberties. But think about it like this. Whenever you join an organization and you violate its rules, it's got to be able to punish you for breaking them. Right? Like no organization is going to survive if you don't punish people who break its rules, right? So the question for the integralists then is whether that logic extends to the sort of ideal political arrangement, that is what the state may do. And I think there's, and I won't go into every bit of the detail of the talk here, on the handout here, but I think there is still at least within Christianity and Catholic Christianity, a way of blocking this idea that the church can authorize the state to use physical force against its members. And it's that the church does not have the power in itself to use physical force for spiritual ends. The church can use physical force to protect its property. The priest can lock the doors, or they can call the police to come and remove someone who's been excommunicated from the church, from church property, or to not allow people to receive communion, or there's the Eucharist. Okay, so you can do all of that, but it does that under its temporal dimension, right? It's understood constitutionally as a civil organization with certain rights. And so when it calls on the police to remove a heretic from the church, it's not doing it, the state isn't helping it pursue a religious agenda. It's rather just enforcing its property rights, right? And so the thought in general is that there's just something internal to Christianity from the very beginning that priests, even though there's a sense in which they're guardians of the polity, don't use physical violence to bring about what they want to bring about, right? And the Catholic Church itself has argued that this is learned directly from the example of Jesus, but also the idea that the power to use physical force to punish was given by God directly to the state. It's not given to the church. And I think the very hardest thing for the integralist position is for them to explain how exactly it is the church has its own native power to use violence. It suggests that in the absence of the state, that priests could be using violence against their flock if they deemed it prudent. And that's the point at which I think I'm willing to draw the line with my interlocutors on this particular position, that at least from a Christian perspective, something's gone wrong when you're saying, at least in principle, priests can use violence against their flock to bring them around, to punish them, to change their views, and so on. Now, I know for, y'all, if you're even interested in this kind of debate, that seems manifestly true, which is good, because I think it means my argument has pretty broad appeal. But I think it even has to have appeal for those pre-modern Catholics that are willing to throw out all of modern liberal democracy. Ultimately, the church cannot authorize the state to use physical force against its members, because the church can't give the state a power that it doesn't have. The church does not have the native power to use physical force. The church gets that authority from God on this picture. Okay. Now, I've actually been involved in 2 symposia right now on the book, where I'm going back and forth with 4 integralists on precisely this point, and I think I've got them. I think the argument here, I think there's a really serious difficulty. I'm being facetious. Whoever really convinces their opponents, after all, but I think it is pretty hard to explain where the church's native power to use physical force is supposed to come from. So ultimately, as intuitive, I think, in certain ways, is this idea within Christianity. Church and state are different. They're both polities in the sense that, they're groups of people with a system of law and decision-making aimed at a common good for the community. Of course, it's the case that if Christianity is true, what the church is doing is more important than what the state is doing. That seems obvious. It's the next step that, and because it is nobler, it can authorize the state to use violence on its behalf. And that's the move, I think, where this kind of view can be blocked. In other religions where this is proposed, you can't do that, because you don't have an explicit, very clear differentiation of church and state that's going back really pretty far. In Islam, for instance, you don't have the theological basis to draw the kind of very, very sharp distinction that Christianity does. Not that there aren't differences between religious and secular function in Islamic states, just to be clear. It's just in Christianity, the theological basis for separation is just much, much more stark, insofar as for many Muslims would reject it even makes any sense at all, whether it's even coherent. So let me sort of back up and review and try to contextualize this for those of you who are unfamiliar with the ins and outs. My analysis of what we have seen in the early 21st century is a series in, I think, the Anglophone world and in the EU, of what we might think of as just elite failure, where elites have had certain responsibilities, for instance, in adequately managing financial crises with the Great Recession, or figuring out how to integrate immigrant populations and refugee populations into their home countries. And so what you have ended up with is, in the United States, you have a terrible kind of political polarization at the mass level, with Republicans and Democrats hating each other. Whereas, for instance, in the EU, the polarization is more between, say, the citizens of democratic citizens of many different countries and what they conceive of as, say, the Brussels elite. And there's a sense, I think, and this is where a lot of right-wing populism gets itself going, is to say, okay, this elite has failed and it needs to be sort of cleaned out or replaced or drained, or something needs to be done, right? And I do think there's a case to be made that liberal democracy had sold itself really hard. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, it looked like the only game in town from at least the 90s for at least until the Great Recession. And no political ideology was ever going to be that dominant anywhere in humanity for that long, right? I mean, liberal democracy is a very, very specific kind of ideological and institutional arrangement. And the idea that it was ever going to be anything like an end of history or whatever was probably not realistic. But I think a couple of things that did happen, and I think in Europe, a great deal of how European countries have dealt with Islamic immigration on the one hand, And also just the European Union just really mismanaged the recovery from the financial crisis, especially compared to the United States, surprisingly enough. I mean, there's still probably economic costs going on. And so between slowing growth rates on the one hand and lots of immigration on the other in Europe, and between a lot of immigration in the United States, but also various institutional failures. In the United States, the Iraq War was one of these, conceived as one of these failures. You don't really get Donald Trump unless you have George W. Bush first. And many over and over and over again, it's Trump's Republican Party is just undoing like everything that Bush's Republican Party did. So you have to understand a lot of what's going on in the Republican Party now is a reaction to perceived failures. Also, Bush tried to integrate a lot of immigrants in the United States and tried to put in what was sometimes called amnesty. And that was, I think, the beginning in the 2007, 2008, where a lot of the anti-immigration sentiment became very, very strong. If you listen to Reagan's last speech, for instance, he's very, very pro-immigration. I mean, he and George H.W. Bush actually were attacking each other in their primary. They ran in 1980. And so it would have been 79 for not being open borders enough. So things, really, really changed. And because there's this sense of sort of declining trust and rising forms of different kinds of polarization, it's created this pervasive distrust, and COVID didn't help at all, especially in the United States. And so essentially you have some of the background that you need for liberal democracy and the toleration of diverse perspectives. You need a certain degree of institutional competence and a sense that elites are not garbage, right? The sense that they're actually helping people and living up to their responsibilities and duties. And there's just very little confidence in much of liberal democracy that is true. So what happens when that confidence declines? Well, people offer alternatives. They say, okay, here's a different ideology, or here's another thing. Let's do this, that, and the other. And one thing you notice in right-wing populist movements generally is that there's so much focus on sort of destroying the sort of left-wing elite that when you ask for the positive program, like what are you for, right? It gets sort of harder and harder to say. Now, I will say this about the current Trump administration. They seem a lot more convicted about what they want to do, although these are mostly executive order policy making because Congress isn't going to be able to pass much of anything given the Republican majority is razor thin. So I think the takeaway I would give you is to say, look, the kind of civilization that we're trying to have is seen as on the rocks in a certain way. Its fundamental claims of respecting universal human rights, of treating people as equals, of trying not to take sides on difficult matters is in doubt. And when it's in doubt, that means that people are going to go back into their past and their history and say, okay, well, what was done in the past, maybe what was done in the past was better. I actually think it's a pretty fruitful kind of intellectual discussion to have. And it's certainly been interesting and a lot of fun to have these conversations because, it's a colorful group of intellectuals who are, willing to say a lot of things and to sort of give students a kind of intellectual freedom to explore certain ideas that, the university system does not always give them. But the reason to take a lot of these ideas seriously ultimately is not so much that they're going to come to pass. It's not going to, that, if Vance becomes president, he's going to submit the American government to Pope Francis or something. That's not the issue. The issue is more when there are elite failures in liberal democratic orders, how do you handle those? How do you stop them or reform them or improve them? Because if you don't have a good answer to that question, if you don't have a good approach and if you dismiss the people who distrust elites as dumb or racist or whatever, you're essentially alienating people and saying, okay, well, why? I was trying to be tolerant, but if they're not going to tolerate, why should I tolerate? Right? If they're going to enforce their views on, say, sex and gender that are incredibly controversial, why shouldn't we push for ours? Right? The logic of liberal democracy is very elegant and I think can be inspiring in a certain way. But if toleration, if mutual respect, equal respect for worldviews starts to break down, I think it can break down pretty quickly. And so I think that particularly for many of you much younger than I am, you're going to be, growing up under a situation, and I know Canada's very different from the United States. It's very different than the UK. but thinking in terms of what happens to the system of ideas in my society under these kinds of conditions, and being prepared to have something to say, to understand where people are coming from, and why some people are so alienated that they feel they have to go for these more radical positions. And I think the thing about integralism that's especially fascinating, I think, is just that of all the different things you could search for, right? Of all the different doctrines you could go for, there's actually some really interesting, really rich detail here that there's not going to be if you go for some kind of, Nietzschean, not that Nietzsche's not great, but a lot of the right-wing Nietzsche stuff is, it's very, very shallow intellectually. The racist stuff, the white nationalist stuff, that's, there's nothing interesting there intellectually. This is one of the only doctrines of the new right that's actually genuinely intellectually interesting to me anyway. But that's just going to be a part and parcel of sort of life in 21st century global democracies, is trying to deal with these difficulties of polarization and lower social institutional trust, and recognizing that if we don't deal with them, that we're dealing with a very different set of ideas and a very different mass psychology than if we're able to address them. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.